Arden stood on the balcony of his quarters, watching as the human warship descended toward Etheri's capital. The city was peaceful, serene, a place where the air was rich with oxygen, and the skies were never touched by storms. It was the perfect environment for the Etheri. No predators, no extreme conditions, just generations of harmonious existence. And then humans had arrived. He had heard the rumors all his life. Humanity was a death-world species, a people born in a world where survival was a daily battle. The stories ranged from the mundane to the terrifying. Tales of wars fought with weapons so powerful they could melt mountains, of human soldiers who could endure unimaginable hardships, of entire civilizations that thrived despite the most hostile conditions imaginable. They were a people who had learned to conquer their environment, and yet Arden wondered if they still carried the scars of that brutal past. The human delegation had arrived under the guise of diplomacy, but Arben couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. Lena Harris, the human leader, was already a subject of much gossip among the Etheri officials. She was tall, her dark hair cropped short and her eyes sharp, unyielding. The humans hadn't brought their usual weapons this time, but their presence was still intimidating. Their warship was a colossal thing, a floating fortress that could turn entire cities to dust in moments. Arden had never seen such a machine up close, and it unnerved him. The Etheri Council had made it clear: maintain distance, and don't be taken in by the humans' charm. They feared the humans would exploit their peaceful nature. But now, seeing the humans up close, Arden was struck by an unsettling thought. How could a species this capable, this hardened by their own history, choose to visit a world as peaceful as Etheri? When the humans finally disembarked, it wasn't with the fearsome aura that Arden had expected. They were calm, efficient, even courteous. Lena Harris spoke with the Etheri diplomats in a smooth, clipped voice, her demeanour professional, but not cold. Her crew, though dressed in the uniforms of military officers, seemed human. They smiled. They made jokes. In a way, it almost seemed as if they were playing a part, one Arden couldn't quite understand. Still, Arden wasn't ready to drop his guard. There was too much to lose. Too many stories of human savagery to ignore. He couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if the humans didn't just want peace? What if they wanted something else? The Grak raiders came without warning. Etheri sensors detected them just hours before they struck, too late to mount a proper defense. The Grak had perfected the art of stealth, using cloaking technology to slip past the Etheri's outer defenses. Arben watched from the command deck as the tactical display flickered, the red dots of Grak ships multiplying faster than their own forces could respond. Despite their advanced technology, the Etheri were not warriors. They had long ago abandoned any need for a military, living in peace with their environment and their neighbours. The sudden reality of war was a shock, and panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Arden could hear the murmurs in the corridors, the rising anxiety in his fellow officers' voices. It was in this moment of desperation that the Etheri leadership called for help. And as the emergency channels buzzed with frantic requests for aid, the humans, those very Deathworlders the Etheri had feared, responded. Lena Harris arrived in person, leading a contingent of human soldiers and officers. The atmosphere in the command room was thick with tension as the humans disembarked from their transport ships. They walked into the room like they owned it, like they had already seen war, and this was just another day. Lena's eyes scanned the room with practiced precision, her face impassive. She was the embodiment of military efficiency, and Arben could already tell that this would be no simple negotiation. Arben, Lena said, acknowledging him with a nod. Her voice was steady, devoid of emotion. "We'll help, but this isn't going to be easy. You're not dealing with raiders. You're dealing with predators who know how to survive." "Then why should we trust you?" Arpin demanded, his voice sharp, defensive. Lena didn't flinch. "Because we know what it's like to face extinction. And if you want to survive, you'll have to learn how to fight." Her words cut through the tension in the room. Lena wasn't offering the help Arpin had expected. She wasn't promising peace or safety. She was offering something more unsettling. A chance to survive, but only if they fought back. The Etheri would need to adapt, to change everything they thought they knew about themselves and their way of life. But there was something in Lena's eyes that gave him pause. A flash of something beyond strategy. Was it pity? The words she spoke next only deepened Arden's unease. "Your culture might be peaceful, but it's not enough to keep you alive. Not anymore." And with that, the real test began. The first days of training were an assault on everything the Etheri had ever known. They had long prided themselves on intellect and diplomacy, using words instead of weapons to settle disputes. But Lena Harris was relentless. She pushed them past their comfort zones, forcing them into physical drills and combat simulations. Every day felt like a new, brutal awakening for Arden and the others. The humans didn't train with flashy weapons or sophisticated technology. Instead, Lena focused on teaching them to think like soldiers. The Etheri, accustomed to peaceful negotiations, found themselves frustrated and exhausted by the repetitive, grueling exercises. Eli Rodriguez, a human officer who served as one of Lena's most trusted lieutenants, worked closely with Arden, drilling him on survival tactics. They spent hours in simulated combat scenarios where the Grak didn't just attack, they hunted. "Think of the Grak as predators," Eli would say, his voice calm but firm. "Out here, the only rule is that there are no rules. If you hesitate, you die. You have to adapt." It was a mindset that felt foreign to Arden, whose species had never known anything but peace. The Etheri soldiers were accustomed to thinking ahead, predicting outcomes, outsmarting their foes with advanced technology and intellect. But the humans were teaching them that intellect alone wouldn't win a battle. The Grak didn't care about their morals or their technological advancements. They cared only about survival, a lesson the Etheri were now forced to learn. The training sessions weren't just physical, they were psychological. Lena spoke of the human experience, of living in a world where death was an everyday possibility, where survival was not guaranteed. She told them of humanity's history, of Earth, a planet that had nearly destroyed itself through war, environmental collapse, and famine. "Humans aren't just survivors," she said, her tone softer than usual. "We're adapters. We face impossible odds, but we don't give up. We find a way to win." The more Arden listened, the more he began to understand. Humans had been forged in the crucible of war and loss, but it had also given them a kind of resilience that the Etheri lacked. Eli was one of the few humans who could still smile after a grueling training session, but even his grin didn't mask the dark circles under his eyes. There was a cost to this kind of strength, a cost the Etheri were only beginning to understand. By the end of the week, Arden wasn't sure if he was more terrified of the Grak or what he was becoming. The training had changed him, chipped away at the illusion of invulnerability his species had lived under for centuries. He began to see the humans not as the monsters of legend, but as something more complex, creatures of war, yes, but also creatures of survival. In their eyes, he saw a kind of strength that was terrifying, yet strangely admirable. In the silent moments between drills, Arden couldn't help but wonder, could the Etheri ever be like the humans? Could they ever embrace war, not for conquest, but for survival. The war had escalated faster than anyone could have imagined. Weeks into the Grak's relentless assault, Ethereal forces were stretched thin. The once proud defensive systems of their homeworld, automated defenses, orbital bombardment platforms, the entire strength of their technological prowess had been rendered useless against the Grak's advanced guerrilla tactics. They adapted too quickly, exploiting every weakness in the Ethereal's strategy. In the midst of all this chaos, Lena Harris remained steadfast, but even she had started to show signs of strain. Arden watched her closely now, not with the same wariness he had at first, but with a growing respect. The human officer was far from invulnerable. There was a wariness in her eyes, a heaviness in her shoulders that spoke of battles fought not just on the front lines, but inside herself. The breaking point came during a disastrous raid on an etheric colony near the eastern rim of their planet. The Grak hit in the dead of night, using an untraceable pulse weapon to disable the colony's power grid. Within hours, they were storming through the streets, plundering everything in sight. The Etheri military was caught completely off guard, and there were too few human reinforcements available to mount an immediate defense. Arden was among those sent to help. As he arrived on the scene with Eli Rodriguez at his side, the destruction was unimaginable. Buildings were burning, people were dead, and the once pristine colony had been reduced to rubble. The worst part, however, was the total disarray of the Etheri soldiers. They were scattered, confused, unsure of how to respond. Their once impeccable training, rooted in intellect and diplomacy, had crumbled in the face of a true enemy. "Get it together," Eli shouted, taking charge with the ease of someone who had fought in far worse circumstances. "You need to move now, or we lose everything." For a moment, Arden hesitated. It was as if something inside him had broken. He had been training for this, yes, but the reality of it was nothing like the simulations. He could feel the weight of his people's vulnerability, the crushing sense of helplessness. "Do it," Lena's voice came through his comms, cold but urgent. "Move now, or this planet is lost." That snapped him out of his trance. Lena was right. The Etheri had no choice but to fight. There was no escaping this, no hiding. Arden gritted his teeth and rallied his troops, using everything the humans had taught him. They fell back on the basics, the tactics, the maneuvering, the ruthlessness. It wasn't enough. They lost the colony. But in those desperate hours, Arden realized something. The humans weren't offering a peaceful solution. They were showing them how to survive. The cost of survival was becoming clearer with each passing minute, and for the first time, Arden understood the full weight of Lena's words. If you want to survive, you fight. There's no other choice. The loss of the eastern colony was a blow the Etheri could not ignore. It was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological wound. Arden could see it in the eyes of his fellow officers, the same fear that had gripped him when the Grak first attacked. Only now it was sharper, more tangible. There was no denying it anymore. The peaceful, intellectual society the Etheri had built could not withstand the savage reality of the galaxy. The aftermath was even more crushing. The Grak had not just destroyed the colony, they had desecrated it. The human soldiers, who had seen countless horrors in their time, had no words for what they saw when they recovered the bodies. The colony's survivors had been slaughtered, but that wasn't what shocked Arden. It was the brutality with which the Grak had struck. The Grak didn't just kill. They tortured, they mutilated, they showed no mercy. To them, the fight was not just about survival, it was about dominating the weak. And it was this lesson, more than any other, that shattered the Etheri's illusions. They had assumed that their advanced technology, their intellect, would be enough to overcome any threat. They were wrong. Arben had been raised on stories of peaceful negotiations, of winning wars with logic and diplomacy, but there was no room for those ideals in a galaxy where species like the Grak existed. The truth was impossible to ignore. They were living on borrowed time, and there were no guarantees. Survival meant embracing the very violence they had spent millennia avoiding. In the weeks following the loss, Arben found himself questioning everything he had believed about the humans. At first, he had seen them as cruel, bloodthirsty creatures, their reputation built on their war-torn history. But now, after the battle, the humanity of the situation was clearer than ever. Lena and her soldiers had not rejoiced in the bloodshed. They had mourned it, quietly, almost in the way they had mourned their own fallen. There was no glory in war for the humans. They had endured it, adapted to it, and had learned the hard way that survival was not an ideal, but a reality of brutality. Late one night, as Arben sat with Eli Rodriguez at a makeshift camp outside the ruined colony, the human officer shared something that struck Arben to the core. "I didn't always want this life," Eli said, looking out at the dark horizon. "We didn't ask for war, but sometimes it's the only way to live, to survive, and that's something no one teaches you until you've seen it yourself." Arben didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply nodded, as if the weight of those words had finally settled in his chest. He had spent his whole life fearing Deathworlders, thinking they were the monsters. Now it was clear. The true monsters were those who couldn't fight back. And the Etheri were beginning to realize they didn't have the luxury of being peaceful anymore. It was a bitter truth, but Arben knew it was one they would all have to accept. The loss of the Eastern colony had changed everything for the Etheri. The idea of peace, of diplomacy, began to feel like an obsolete relic of a past that no longer had a place in the galaxy they now inhabited. The Grak had forced them into a corner, and the humans, though merciless in their efficiency, had shown them how to fight back. Arben stood on the balcony of a high-rise in the Etheri capital, looking out at the city he had once believed was invulnerable. The skyline, bathed in the golden light of Etheri's twin suns, now seemed somehow fragile. He had thought his species' way of life was enough to protect them. But the Grak had shattered that illusion, and now there was no turning back. The war had not just redefined Etheri's military capabilities, it had redefined their identity. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling on Lena Harris, who stood at the center of the command room, going over battle reports with her officers. She looked no different from the hardened human soldier he had first encountered, but there was something about her now that seemed even more distant, more focused. The human warships had been instrumental in repelling the Grak, but it was the lessons of survival, the cold, pragmatic teachings Lena had forced them to adopt, that had changed everything. They were no longer just Etheri soldiers, they were warriors, like the humans, ruthless, efficient, and willing to sacrifice everything for victory. "We've done what we can," Lena said, turning toward Arden with a tired but resolute look. "But this war isn't over. The Grak were just the beginning. There's something bigger coming, something worse." Arben stiffened at the mention of this bigger threat. They had been hearing rumors of an enemy much more insidious than the Grak, an alien faction that manipulated entire systems, using the Grak as a pawn in a much larger game. Lena had told him about them before, but Arben couldn't yet fathom what could be worse than the Grak, an enemy that would not just kill, but tear down entire civilizations from within. "What do we do now?" Arden asked, his voice steady but unsure. Lena met his gaze. There was no pity in her eyes, no false hope, just cold, hard reality. "We fight, and this time we fight smart. We build our forces, we unite. If we're going to face what's coming, we'll need every species on our side. And that means trusting each other, even when it's hard. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Arden understood. Survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about forging alliances, about facing the future with eyes wide open, prepared for the challenges ahead. The Etheri had always been an isolated people, hiding behind their peaceful reputation. But now, they were no longer just a species of thinkers. They were becoming a species of warriors, standing shoulder to shoulder with their human allies. The battle for Etheri had just begun, but Arden now saw that it was part of something much larger. The true war was only beginning, and survival depended on how far they were willing to go. As the weeks dragged on, the reality of the looming threat became undeniable. The Etheri had thrown everything they had at the Grak, and yet the true danger still lay ahead. The Grak were savage, yes, but they were just a piece of a much larger puzzle. The mysterious faction Lena had warned Arden about, the one that had orchestrated the Grak's attacks, was now moving into position. Its agents were everywhere, infiltrating systems, manipulating alliances, destabilizing whole sectors of the galaxy. The Human-Etheri alliance was all that stood between the galaxy and an extinction-level threat. But this time, it wasn't just about brute strength. The new enemy was clever, insidious, and calculating. They didn't want to conquer Etheri or Earth. They wanted to collapse them from within. Lena was busy coordinating the growing military campaign. She had taken charge of the newly formed coalition of allied species, humans, Etheri, and others who had reluctantly joined the fight. The alliance was still fragile, the distrust among the different species palpable, but Lena had a way of bringing them together, uniting them with a shared goal of survival. She had become something of a legend in the making, a symbol of leadership forged in the fires of war. Arden, meanwhile, had been thrust into a role he never expected. His experience with the Grak had given him an edge in tactical planning, but this new enemy was a different beast entirely. He found himself leading joint operations with human officers, like Eli Rodriguez, soldiers whose skills were now indispensable in the fight against the shadowy forces manipulating their every move. The training had come full circle. Arden had learned from the humans, but now the humans were learning from him. Eli, once so confident in his own methods, had been forced to adapt, just as Arden had. It was no longer enough to rely on brute force. They needed intelligence. They needed subterfuge. And above all, they needed unity. The first strike against the enemy came in the form of a covert operation. A joint task force, led by Arden and Eli, infiltrated a key communication hub suspected of being controlled by the mysterious faction. The mission was perilous. The forces they faced were well-equipped, but not invincible. It was a test, a trial to see if the new alliance could work as one. When they breached the facility, the enemy was waiting for them. It was clear that this was no ordinary battle. The real war had begun. Arden's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. They were ready. They had no choice but to be. As the first shots rang out, Arden realized something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about saving everything they had ever known. Their future depended on how they fought in this moment. The mission was a blur of gunfire, smoke, and calculated chaos. The enemy had anticipated the strike, and their forces were prepared. But the Human-Etheri alliance, now working seamlessly together, pushed forward with a brutality born of desperation. Arden had never seen his people fight like this before. He could feel the change in them. The hesitation that had once paralyzed their soldiers had been replaced with a cold, pragmatic resolve. The Etheri were no longer just thinkers. They were now soldiers, adapted, if not fully hardened, to the brutal reality of war. As Arden and Eli Rodriguez led their forces deeper into the enemy facility, the true scale of the operation began to unfold. The command center, a sleek, alien structure buried beneath the surface of a moon in an uncharted system, pulsed with energy. The operation's goal was clear: disable the faction's communication network and prevent them from coordinating their next move. But as Arden moved through the facility, a growing sense of dread gnawed at him. The enemy wasn't just controlling the Grak. They were pulling strings across multiple species, cultivating chaos on a galactic scale. The deeper they pushed, the more Arden realized the war they were fighting wasn't just a defense of Etheri, Earth, or any one world. It was a fight for the very soul of the galaxy. They reached the heart of the facility, an enormous control room glowing with holographic displays of interplanetary systems, filled with data streams and encrypted files. But it was also filled with something else. Tortured prisoners, species from all over the galaxy, their bodies linked to the facility's vast neural network. The enemy wasn't just attacking, they were manipulating. These prisoners were being used to fuel a weaponized eye, a tool that could break civilizations from the inside out. As the team set explosives and prepped for extraction, a realization hit Arden like a thunderclap. The Etheri weren't the only ones at risk. Every species was vulnerable. The true war had never been about conquering planets or enslaving races. It was about erasing the very concept of peace. The enemy didn't care about territory. They cared about control, about dismantling the foundational ideals of every society. The explosion shook the facility to its core, signaling their success, but also their loss. As Arden and Eli made their way back to their ship, Arden's mind raced. The victory was hollow. They had made a dent, yes, but the enemy was still out there, still scheming, still waiting. Back on Etheri, Lena Harris's words echoed in Arden's mind. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning. The war was far from over, and now more than ever, Arden understood what it meant to survive. The cost would be high, but it had to be paid, because in the galaxy they now inhabited, peace was a luxury they could no longer afford.